Hey guys, this is Dave Mitro. I'm a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also the residency program director. And I'm going to be giving you a talk today for your basic exam. I want to wish you guys luck. This is not a very scientific talk, so you can kind of sit back and relax, but it does potentially give you a few freebie points. And this is based on the content outline, and this talk will be on physician impairment or disability and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have nothing to disclose. Anyone looking along with my slides sees that the words Americans with Disabilities Act is in red. If you see something in red on one of my slides, that means that it was listed on the ABA exam content outline or as a keyword for the ABA basic exam. So I would pay more attention to red words if I were you, but it's up to you. The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990 and amended in 2009. And the purpose of this act is to prohibit discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else. And that is specifically list three things: employment, purchasing of goods, and participating in government services. So you cannot discriminate against someone in those areas because of a disability, and this act was modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In order to be protected by the ADA, a person must have a disability, and a disability is left vague by this act. It is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived as others by having such an impairment. So since it does not specifically name everything, it is open to interpretation. So when it comes to the ADA and your patients, this act specifically prohibits discrimination in the provision of health care based on a disability, and I think we all know that. I will mention that physicians have been cleared of wrongdoing when they could prove based on a credible scientific basis that caring for the patient would threaten the health and safety of others. And an example of this would be, a timely example of this would be the pediatricians who are refusing to treat patients who haven't been vaccinated. So scientific basis says if they were in a waiting room with the disease, they could spread it to other patients, and that's how the ADA could not apply to those patients. So when it comes to physicians and the ADA or their impairment or disability, you cannot discriminate in hiring or keeping an employee who can perform the essential functions of their job. And they can either do this job without aid, or if they need a reasonable accommodation. If either of those things are true, the ADA stops you from discriminating against those individuals. In red, visual and auditory impairment in physicians. And so this was from a content outline. And visual and auditory impairment would be covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the question, I don't know how they would ask this on a test, but the question you would ask yourself, can this physician still perform the essential functions of an anesthesiologist in this case? So can they do it without aid? So someone who has a disability, but they can still perform all the functions, you cannot discriminate against them. Or if they need reasonable accommodations. Again, there's no strict definition. Reasonable accommodations obviously is open to interpretation, but if they can do the job with reasonable accommodations, they cannot be discriminated against. Physician aging being the key word, something to be aware of is there was an Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and that was passed in 1967. And this is making me a little sad because I'm actually covered by this, not knowing anyone at least 40 years of age is covered by this discrimination because of their age. And that's for purposes of hiring, promotion, wages, and termination. So as long as you can perform the functions of your job, you cannot be discriminated against because of this act. When you talk about a mandatory retirement age, that is not permitted, and it is only permitted for a certain subgroup of individuals, and that's defined as an executive over the age of 65 in high policy-making positions who are entitled to a pension over a minimum yearly amount. And unless something changes drastically, none of us as anesthesiologists are going to be in this CEO golden parachute era that this would apply to us. So you cannot have a mandatory retirement-based age. So when we're talking about disability, one thing that comes up for anesthesiologists is substance abuse. So to clarify how the ADA views substance abuse, or how you would interpret substance abuse, someone who is currently engaging in the illegal use of drugs is not an individual with a disability. But someone who is not currently engaged in drugs but has a history of past drug addiction may be considered someone with a disability, and that's if the drug addiction substantially limited a major life activity. So someone who's doing illegal things right now is not going to be protected by the ADA, but if they have a history of it, they would be. So when we talk about substance abuse in anesthesiology, we need to get a couple definitions down. So first, abuse, and that would be adverse consequences from repeated use of a substance, which is different than dependence. So dependence is continued use despite problems, and those would include withdrawal, the need for taking larger amounts, and unsuccessful attempts to quit or control the use, in addition to an increasing amount of time used to seek this substance. So abuse and dependence are two different things. Signs of chemical dependence. Again, this should be a freebie question for you guys on this exam, but things, since it was a keyword, things that you would tend to see would be withdrawal from family and friends, changes in behavior and mood swings. Usually addicts like to work alone because it's easier to divert drugs. They use a high amount of opioids in their patients. They volunteer for extra work, and this just gives them better access to the drugs. Physical signs that you may see include pinpoint pupils, wearing of long sleeves to hide needle marks, and weight loss, pale skin. So I would hope in this exam, which could have a lot of hard questions, that you should be able to get this one. Substance abuse in anesthesiology. So in general, it's debatable if physicians have a higher rate of substance abuse than the general population. We do know that physicians are less likely to seek help, however. We also know that anesthesiologists are disproportionately represented in treatment facilities. So there's a greater number of anesthesiologists in treatment facilities than there are percentage of anesthesiologists in the country. And some of the reasons for that would include the fact that there's the proximity of drugs that you work with every day. It's easy to divert those drugs. Anesthesiologists do have high-stress jobs, and we tend to, at least my wife says, we have controlling personalities. And there is some question about, is this an actual number, or is it just a greater success we have in reporting because we're good at knowing that this is a problem and being educated in this. So that's where the controversy comes into how prevalent it is in anesthesiology. What we do know about substance abuse in anesthesiology is that the primary drug of choice is opioids. Anesthesiologists in general have a higher rate of IV drug abuse than other physicians, or drug use than other physicians. And I think that's because we are comfortable with IV drugs and use them every day. There is a great controversy about anesthesiologists returning to the workplace after treatment for abuse. A common way that people are discovered using drugs or relapsing in drugs is the fact that they die. So that creates a great controversy. And there's many different studies out there and many different opinions. And however, if I was taking an ABA exam, I would be looking at the ABA most recent study, which came from JAMA of 2013. And this showed that anesthesiology residents with drug abuse in training had a relapse, and they defined a relapse of one incident That relapse rate was 43%. So if they're asking you about any kind of relapse rate, the ABA's own study showed 43% if they had a problem in residency. That's a number I would keep in my head. When it comes to substance abuse reporting, many states have laws that say you must report your colleagues if you suspect them of practicing while impaired. So it's putting a requirement on you. And how do you do that? Well, it depends on your practice. You may be somewhere that you can report it to a chair or the director of your site, or your hospital may have a physician wellness committee that will take care of the notifying of the other individuals that need to be, the other individuals and organizations that need to be notified. If not, or in addition to, or instead of, there are state physician health programs and licensing board programs that are out there. And we do have this responsibility to watch out for our patients by policing ourselves. Reporting someone does provide protection to the physician being reported. It is confidential. The discovery process is protected under peer review. And this last line is important. Protection may be lost if legal or competence issues arise. So if someone can get help before there's legal issues or competence issues, that's going to be much easier for them to navigate and return to work than if those other things did occur. Fatigue is a key word, and you guys are probably fatigue studying for this test, but what I can say about fatigue and anesthesiologists, your average anesthesiologist work week is greater than 55 hours. Nighttime work causes disturbances in your sleep-wake cycle. So not only is it 55 hours a week or more, sometimes at night, sometimes at day, that makes it more difficult. Anytime you have sleep deprivation and circadian disruption, your cognition, performance, mood, and health can all be affected. As far as sleep loss goes, it's been shown that acute sleep loss, like would occur on call overnight, and chronic sleep deprivation have similar neurobehavioral impairment patterns. Looking at these patterns, acute sleep deprivation is similar to alcohol intoxication. So these are things that could affect care and we have to be aware of. There have been surveys to anesthesia providers that have identified fatigue and errors as being linked, and that's self-reported data. And of note, the demands of night call are identified as the most stressful and usually frequently cited as impetus towards retirement of anesthesiologists. Probably the most famous case of fatigue that you should be aware of is the Libby Zion case. This is about a college freshman who died 24 hours after admission to the hospital, and this was in New York. And when she came to the hospital, 2 residents took care of her and were covering multiple patients overnight. They were fatigued, they were overworked. There ended up being a complication, a medication complication that occurred, and when that occurred, one of the residents was sleeping, the other was busy covering other patients, which really led to a lot of regulations and overhaul of how we were treating our residents. Libby Zion's father was a lawyer, and he ultimately pushed for what has become the ACGME duty hour restriction. So you guys know those. You can only work a certain amount of hours in a row. You can only work so much a week. You have to have a day off every week. So that was an effort by Libby Zion's father to improve care for patients. Must remember, however, that there's no such restriction for attending. So your built-in protection doesn't necessarily exist when you become an attending. If you are fatigued, there are some strategies you can use. You need to know that beneficial sleep habits outside the hospital are important. So it does me as a program director no good to send one of the residents home because of duty hours and have that resident decide to go out that night and stay out late in the morning and come into work the next day. So outside the hospital, your sleep habits are very important. We try to limit the number of night shifts and the length of these shifts. Those are important strategies. You take breaks when you can to avoid fatigue. naps, strategic napping prior to call or during call. If you see some of the big tech companies today, they have nap pods built right into their work areas, and they show that increases the productivity of their workers. So you have someone working for a tech company, they are paid to sleep at work because they know it will increase the productivity when they're not sleeping. So we have to look at that ourselves as physicians. And I will mention caffeine during long shifts, using it wisely may be a strategy. So that is the end of my talk. As I said, not very scientific, hopefully some freebie points for you, and I hope that you guys do well in your test. Good luck.